From the beginning, I wanted to be the best. I had a constant craving, a yearning to improve and be the best. I never needed any external forces to motivate me. I didn't need that extra push to be great. From day one, I wanted to dominate. My mindset was, I'm going to figure you out. Whether it was AI, Tracy, Vince, or if I was coming up today, LeBron, Russ, Steph, my goal was to figure you out. And to do that, to figure those puzzles out, I was willing to do way more than anyone else. That was the fun part for me. And this is an excerpt from the Mamba Mentality, How I Play by Kobe Bryant.
Welcome to Performers, the podcast that takes you into the minds of the world's most extraordinary athletes, coaches, and performers. We're your hosts. I'm Dr. Greg Young, and you've just heard from Dr. Duncan Simpson. And as sports psychology experts, we'll guide you through the pages of their autobiographies, revealing the mindsets, strategies, and habits that propelled the world's best to the pinnacle of their fields. So why this book, Duncan?
This is a pretty unique book and a little bit intimidating, if I'm honest. It's written purely about Kobe's mindset. And the book and the subsequent topics we discuss really do jump around a little bit. And so we've done our best to kind of reorganize it, make it a little bit of a coherent story. Although, because it's not an autobiography, Greg, there's not really that career timeline or life timeline like we've seen in the other autobiographies. Kobe obviously, unfortunately, never got to write an autobiography as he passed away in 2020 along with his 13-year-old daughter Gianna and 7 others. But he did write the Mamba Mentality, and it's a great book, so we'll dive in. So, Greg, this podcast may look like it's free, but it isn't free. There's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that we put into it. So what does it cost those listening?
Well, I'd say that the only cost for you right now is to pause the show, hop over to whatever platform you choose to listen, or you can actually watch us now as well. Click on follow up, subscribe, give us a hopefully 5-star rating. And here's the next bit. I want you to share it with at least 2 friends, or at least 2 people that you know. Don't even have to be friends, because that's what great performers do. They help the people around them get better too. And we think that if you can share this with 2 other people, then that can help raise the bar across the field. Lastly, if you want to dive deeper into any of the books we discuss, please support the authors and click the links in the show notes to get a hold of them. And this will again help to support the show. Now back to the important stuff.
Well, as I mentioned, this isn't an autobiography, and we're not really going to dive into anything off-court. The book doesn't go into any of his off-court issues. I do want to highlight that he is a polarizing figure, but because we're not really qualified or informed enough about some of the situations that happen off-court, we're just really going to stick to the situations in the book. So his accomplishments on-court are quite phenomenal. So I'll just read off a list. 5-time NBA champion, 2-time NBA Finals MVP, a 2-time Olympic champion, NBA Most Valuable Player, 2-time scoring champ, 18-time All-Star, 15-time All-NBA team selection, 4th most in points scored all time. He was inducted into the Naismith Memorial Hall of Fame in 2020. And strangely enough, and I didn't actually know this, in 2018, he won an Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film. So there you go. So I do think it's important to set up the book for those that don't know who Kobe Bryant is. I don't know where you've been living, but if you don't know who Kobe Bryant is, just a little bit into his background. He was born in 1978 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and was named after the Japanese city of Kobe. He was the son of Joe Jellybean Bryant, a former NBA player, and Pamela Cox Bryant. In 1984, following his dad's retirement from the NBA, Kobe and his family moved to Italy, where his father continued his playing career in the Italian league. Kobe grew up in Italy, learning to speak fluent Italian, while also developing a passion for basketball and soccer. Not surprising, as he was in Italy. He also had a very athletic family. His 2 sisters, Shea and Shoraya, are also very athletic and prominent athletes in their own right. The family returned to Philadelphia in 1991 when he was 13 years of age, and Kobe attended the Lower Merion High School. There, he made a significant impact on the basketball team, leading them to a state championship for 4 consecutive years. His exceptional talent caught the attention of NBA scouts, and despite his academic achievements, he was a very good scholar. With high SAT scores, Kobe decided to bypass college and enter the NBA directly from high school, which was very unusual even back then. And in 1996, in the NBA draft, Kobe was initially selected by the Charlotte Hornets as the 13th overall pick, but then was quickly traded to the LA Lakers, marking the start of his illustrious NBA career. So we're going to start with a little bit of background from one of he calls him his favorite all-time teammate, Pau Gasol. And when Pau got traded to the Lakers, Pau immediately gets a phone call from Kobe. Kobe called me that morning, asking me to meet up once I arrived at the Ritz-Carlton. It was past 1 a.m. when I finally got to my room, and shortly afterwards, I heard someone knocking at my door. It was Kobe. To me, that was a tremendous demonstration of a true leader, and our meeting had a huge impact on me instantly. The message was clear. There was no time to waste. The moment was now. Let's go get ourselves a ring. His mindset was unmistakable. It was all about winning. So you get traded to a new team and you get a meeting with their star player at 1 a.m. in the morning, Greg.
That's got to be terrifying and comforting all at the same time. I don't know what happened at 1 a.m. in the morning, but that there's someone there that's such a great leader must be quite a comforting thought, knowing that when you parachute into a new team, that there's someone around you that really wants to bring you along for the ride.
And more from Pau. And Pau says, one of the qualities that has made Kobe so successful and always will is his attention to detail. He always used to tell us, if you want to be a better player, you have to prepare, and prepare some more. His dissection of the game was at another level. I'm a player who watches a lot of tape. I like to watch my opponent's last game to see how they're playing at that point that I'm about to face them. But Kobe took it a few steps further than that. So you're never too big to do the small things, Greg, and watching tape seems to be one of those small tasks, but an important task in pro sports, but it's about intentionality.
It is about knowing what to look for. I think there's a difference between watching sport as a sort of a casual viewer or as a maybe even a spectator, but to actually watch it and get as much information as you can possibly get from it. We saw a little bit of this with some of the good habits that Mike Tyson had in our last episode, that he didn't necessarily do all the time. But when he did this was something that he felt gave him a competitive advantage. And I think we're seeing exactly the same thing here.
We continue, one more quote from Pau, and he says, in my entire career, I have never seen a player as dedicated to being the best. His determination is unparalleled. He unquestionably worked harder than anyone else I've ever played with. Kobe knew that to be the best, you needed a different approach from everyone else. Over the years, a lot of people have wondered how difficult it must have been to play with Kobe. It really wasn't. All you had to do was to understand where he was coming from, what he was about, and how badly he wanted to win. He would challenge players and coaches to match his intensity, his desire, to bring their very best every single day. Not just at games, but at practices too. Kobe wanted to find out what you were made of, and if he could count on you to help him win. Plain and simple. So Pau was obviously a teammate that loved this approach. He's talking here dedication, hard work, intensity, desire, and he's really telling you, how much Kobe challenged not just his teammates, but the coaches he worked with.
The thing that we're saying here, the thing that separates the very, very, very good from the absolute elite is mentality or mindset. And those things, dedication, hard work, intensity, desire, challenging others, those are characteristics that don't care how good you are at the game or the sport or the profession or the performance that you do. Those things are completely separate from those. When we talk about athletes, and I've sold mental performance training and mental skills training to athletes this way, and I know you have too, Duncan, is when everyone gets bigger, everyone gets fitter, everyone gets faster and stronger, and they're doing the same technical and tactical stuff. They're watching the same video and looking at the same clips, and they're using the same equipment and eating the same food and using the same supplements. What's the separating factor going to be? And 9 times out of 10, that separating factor is going to be some aspect of the mental game. So the fact that Kobe was so focused on that and wanted to bring other people along for the ride and make essentially the whole organization mentally better, man, that's going to separate the very, very good from the absolute elite.
So you mentioned the absolute elite. We've got the most successful NBA coach of all time here, Phil Jackson. And he says, it's one thing to have talent, but another to have the drive to learn the nuances. James Naismith is credited to having said, basketball is an easy game to play, but a difficult game to master. Kobe came into the NBA with a desire and talent to be one of the greatest players of all time. He achieved that goal through his dedication and perseverance. In retrospect, Kobe was as patient with me as I was with him. We tolerated each other, and the result was that we came to understand how disciplined our team had to become in order to win the coveted championship. As much as he loved to score, Kobe usually knew what the right thing to do was for the team in the right moment. Phil Jackson's really talking about the nuances of the game, there's the small details. It's great to have talent, but how do you couple talent with hard work and then also the desire to get better and to learn the game?
There's the old cliche that hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. I like to believe that because it gives us underdogs, us less talented, a little bit of a chance to compete. But really, what this is that the harnessing of all of that effort and that perseverance and that relentlessness, if that's the right word.
Yeah.
And I think focusing on the details and learning the nuances that you mentioned there, that's all about gaining a competitive advantage. That is, how do you take that and apply that to someone who's maybe a better athlete, a better shooter, a better dribbler, a better rebounder than you? How do you take all of those little things that you learn, the nuances of the game, and then apply them to give you the edge during performance? Even if you're maybe not better than that person, can you still outwork them, knowing that if they take their foot off the gas? And we saw this again with Tyson and Evander Holyfield, right? Evander Holyfield worked his socks off for 17 weeks, I think. Mm-hmm. Tyson did nothing. Tyson, the better boxer, got knocked out.
And we hear a little bit from Kobe now, and that passion for learning. As a kid, I would work tirelessly on adding elements to my game. I would see something I liked in a person or on film, go practice it immediately, practice it more the next day, and then go out and use it. By the time I reached the league, I had a short learning curve. I could see something, download it, and have it down pat. So Greg, we talk about learning, maybe we get into a little bit of motor control here. Learning is about transfer and then also the retention of knowledge.
Absolutely. For me, there's really three parts to learning. The first part for me is acquisition of the skill. So actually gaining the skill, going through the process of learning what that is, if it's a physical movement or if it's, something maybe a little bit more paper and pencil, something more academic, going through that. The second part is retaining that. Just because you learned it in the moment, if you don't retain that information or that physical skill over a period of time, you can't really say that you've learned it. So you have to be able to do it repeatedly and ideally repeat it in different contexts. So be able to transfer that into situations where it's actually going to appear. So how does this show up for basketball? You might be working on, let's say, a dribbling move. If you're doing that just by yourself, unopposed in an empty gym, that's one way to learn the skill. But are you able to then transfer that into the performance environment when there's people literally trying to stop you from getting to the basket or stop you from doing that skill? That's when we know that someone's really, really learned.
That's great. That's a great breakdown. And a little bit more about his approach to learning. And he said, if I wanted to implement something new into my game, I'd see it and try incorporating it immediately. I wasn't scared of missing, looking bad, or being embarrassed. That's because I always kept the end result, the long game, in mind. I always focused on the fact that I had to try something to get it. And once I got it, I'd have another tool in my arsenal. If the price was a lot of work and a few missed shots, I was okay with that. What I love here, Greg, he's thinking about learning as that long-term perspective. And I think so many people think about learning in a very short context. And how can I get this skill down immediately and implement it immediately? And he's talking long game. He's thinking about, I can get this into my toolbox and maybe down the line, maybe a couple of years from now, I'll be able to implement it.
Difficult things are difficult. And that should come as no surprise. So if you're trying to do something that's really tough, and if we're talking about someone competing at the professional level, by definition, the things that you do in those contexts are going to be hard. So being okay with messing things up, I've heard the acronym for FAIL used, frequent attempts in learning. And that's really what we're talking about here, that willingness to go out there and experiment and figure out what worked and what didn't work and refine. And it's all about evolution. The more you can take a skill, polish it, practice it, evolve it, test it, tweak it, all of these different things, the more robust and resilient that skill is going to be over a period of time. But unfortunately, that takes a mindset that you're playing the long game and not the short game. You don't get those immediate returns.
And a little bit more just along that same path. And I think I just love listening to him here. And he says, you can pick up on a nuance or weakness by studying tape and paying attention during workouts. In fact, I was constantly scouting teammates and opponents. I would learn how physically complete their game was, how well they persevered, and identified weaknesses right there and then. I would file that away until we eventually played against each other. What separates great players from all-time great players is their ability to self-assess, diagnose weaknesses, and turn those into strengths. I mean, there's so much in that. You know, that idea of he's scouting his teammates, his opponents, because his teammates will be opponents probably at some stage, identifying weaknesses. And he, at that last sentence, I'm just going to read it again. What separates great players from all time great players is their ability to self assess, diagnose weaknesses, and turn those flaws into strengths.
Absolutely fantastic. I think we might have mentioned this. It might have been all the way back in with Andre Agassi in episode 1, where we talked about the importance of self-awareness and being able to have an understanding of what's going on with you. And then that ability to then use, if we're talking about the mental game, mental skills to, with the end game being self-regulate. And that's the process that he's just outlined here. It fits absolutely perfectly. Have an understanding of what's going on with you in your game and, of course, the people around you. Be able to understand what needs to be fixed in the moment and then fix them in the moment. And that's a basic process of self-awareness to self-regulation. I love it. Beautiful.
And this self-awareness really obviously lends itself perfectly to a routine. And he says, over the years, my routine might have changed some, but my philosophy never did. If something has worked for other greats before you, and if something is working for you, why change it up and embrace some new fad? Stick with what works, even if it's unpopular. So Kobe is notorious that he had a very strict routine, but he was also flexible in his mindset. So that idea of strong beliefs held loosely.
The thing with routines is that you need to be in control of your routines. And what do we mean by in control? It means you're in charge. And if you need to tweak things or change things, then you're able to do that. And it doesn't have a massive damaging psychological impact on you. When we talk sometimes about superstitions or rituals, those are generally things that have a little bit of control over you. And you might feel a little bit strange if you don't keep it perfectly. You mentioned the word flexibility there. You know, that idea of mental agility as opposed to mental fragility, being able to move and flex with what's going on in the moment, hugely important, as opposed to if you're so rigid and if something doesn't go absolutely perfect for you, you've basically taken yourself out of the game. I think this is this idea of a routine, doing what you do on purpose, with purpose, very, very important here.
And part of his routine were his legendary midnight workouts. And he says, my midnight workouts have become a thing of legend. They were always at the same time. Starting early helped me balance basketball and life. When my kids woke up in the morning, I was there, and they wouldn't even know I had just finished at the gym. At night, I'd be able to put them to bed, go out again during my own time, not theirs. I wasn't willing to sacrifice my game, but I also wasn't willing to sacrifice my family time. So I decided to sacrifice sleep, and that was that. So it's an interesting approach here. We've heard from other people how sometimes their investment in their careers is to the detriment of others and the relationships. Kobe saying, I'm not willing to do that, but I am going to sacrifice sleep. So I'd love you to dive into that notion of sacrifice in one area, investment in one area, but there comes a cost.
At what cost? That's the question we've asked in a lot of these episodes as we've gone through. And we mentioned last week with Mike Tyson about the notion of living a high performance lifestyle. And I don't think anyone could really argue that Kobe isn't living a high performance lifestyle. And what did I mean by that when I mentioned that last week? It was eating like a champion, sleeping like a champion, fueling like a champion, looking after your body like a champion. I don't think Kobe's really ticking one of those boxes with the sleeping like a champion piece here. And if you think about how good Kobe Bryant was, can you imagine how good he'd be on a full tank of sleep? That's just a wild thing to contemplate.
Well, he was a notorious napper, so I know that for,
Oh,
I
I
know that for
see.
a
Oh, I
fact.
didn't know that.
Well, a little bit more about kind of film study from a young age, because I think this gives an insight into his mindset. I'm not sure that kids these days do this, but he says from a young age, a very young age, I devoured film and watched everything I could get my hands on. It was always fun to watch, study, and ask the most important question, why? The biggest element that changed over time, however, was that I went from watching what was there to watching for what was missing and what should have been there. I went from watching what happened to what could have happened and what should have happened. Film study eventually became imagining alternatives, counters, options, in addition to finite details of why some actions work and others don't work. So we talked about intentionality, but I love that idea. He's not just looking at what happened, but what could have happened, what should have happened, and alternatives. And for me, it's it's imagery, it's visualization. He's watching game film, but also he's also mentally processing options and tactical awareness and technical elements to the game, and he's devouring it.
It sounds quite similar to what Pat Summitt did when she was trying to learn about the game and the nuances of the game and thinking, okay, what could we learn from this offense and this defense, and trying to implement those. If you've got that singular focus and you're able to sit down and really go through this and get an understanding of what went well, what could happen, and how do we do this better, that's a really simple process for improving your performance.
And he says, during my early years in the NBA, I was surprised to learn that I took a different, more fundamental and serious approach to footwork than a lot of players. I learned that approach when I was young in Europe. There, our practices included scrimmages where we weren't allowed to dribble. So later, when I moved to the States, I had all the footwork down from those days. Only after mastering pivots, reverse pivots, inside reverse pivots, outside reverse pivots, did I work on the sexier between the legs, behind the back, and crossovers. So for me, simplicity is complexity resolved. And he's really saying this is a complex sport, but how do we make it as simple as possible? And it's down to perfecting the fundamentals. And he learned that in Europe. Shout out to Europe.
Shout out to Europe. The fundamentals are the fundamentals for a reason. When you were reading through Kobe's accolades there at the top of the episode, I think you mentioned that he went into the NBA Hall of Fame. And I think in his class was Tim Duncan, one of my favorite players at the San Antonio Spurs. And his nickname was, for 5 points?
I can't remember.
The big fundamental. Right? Nothing particularly flashy. Obviously, very, very good. Nothing particularly flashy about his game. Basic, fundamental, solid basketball, and that is good enough to get you into the Hall of Fame. And there's proof in the pudding right there. But going back to your earlier point, that idea of simplicity is complexity resolved. I think Einstein said the best way to understand whether you've learned something is, can you simply explain it to someone else? And I think if you could take something incredibly complicated, digest it, analyze it, pull it to pieces, and then you've got a very simple product coming out of the back end. I think we see that in a lot of different industries. That's what the leaders in fields do. They take the complex and they make it simple, digestible, and applicable.
And that leads in perfectly because he says, as a kid, and I'm talking 6 years old, it bothered me when something felt like a weakness. So I worked really hard on my left hand at that age. Specifically, I'd brush my teeth with my left hand. I would write my name with my left hand. I hated the feeling of being uncomfortable. Now, Greg, there's some really interesting research that shows that one differentiator between elite and sub-elite is that willingness of the elite to work on deficiencies, whereas the sub-elite prefer to focus on their strengths.
One of the things that I've noticed working with youth athletes in the past is, what do they do when they're given free rein to kind of conduct their own sort of practice, their own training? And what I've seen, and I notice this a lot with golfers, because when they're in control of their own practice, it is very much them, and there's no teammates or anything like that they've got to worry about, is they'd go and they'd work on things that they're already really, really good at. So they didn't embrace the opportunity to maybe work on some of the deficiencies or some of the things that they weren't necessarily good at. And I think, as you said, that's a separating factor. If you can bring the floor up as well as raising the ceiling of your performance, where it's, you're strengthening those weaknesses while pushing those strengths forward, and you perhaps even using those strengths to address those weaknesses, that's something that's going to be able to take you to the next level.
To kind of put a cap on this learning section, he says, I built my game to have no holes. It doesn't matter how well you knew my game. It doesn't matter if we played it against each other for years, or you were even a teammate for a stretch. None of that helped you guard me. So that's his idea. Like, my game is going to have no holes, and he will work on his weaknesses to make sure he has that all-round perfect game. So he says, I didn't train only my body. I trained my mind too. The only way I was able to pick up details on the court, to be aware of the minutiae on the hardwood, was by training my mind to do that off the court and focusing on every detail in my daily life. By reading, by paying attention in class and in practice, by working, I strengthened my focus. By doing all of that, I strengthened my ability to be present and not to have a wandering mind. So I love the phrase, focus is the shepherd of the mind. And he is really directing it accordingly. And he's also starving distractions. He's working on his mindset off the court. And this is at a young age. He's talking about being in class, and he's working on his focus to have it applicable to basketball.
You've talked about starving distractions and the idea of being the shepherd of the mind. This is something that is trainable and can be trained, and something that is actually very simply trained by focusing on things that are relevant and trying to ignore things that aren't relevant. And when those things do appear, not feeding that distraction, but starving that distraction and returning back to the thing of focus.
And obviously, he did a lot of work on his own, but he also got a lot of help from other people. And he acknowledges that throughout the book. And he says, just as important as reading was cultivating relationships with the greats who'd come before me. As evidence of this, look at my retirement ceremony and who was there. That will tell you how I managed to get my jerseys up there. You had Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, Jerry West, James Worthy. Those guys taught me lessons that gave me an edge over my competition. That's why I think it's so important to have mentors, those North Stars who you can learn from and look up to. I love that. We've talked a lot about mentors. We've talked about meeting that one coach, that one person in your life that kind of directs them. We've seen that throughout some of the performers we've covered so far. He's literally listed off about 6 all-time greats that he has the opportunity to interact with and to learn from.
What a team that would have been if you were able to put those guys on the floor. That would be unbeatable. But yes, it does go back to what we talked about in an earlier episode of being able to pick the brains of people, heroes essentially, certainly heroes of the game. And that list there, so we had Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, Jerry West, James Worthy. If my basketball history serves me correct, I think all bar Bill Russell were LA Laker legends. So does this speak again to the access to heroes and the environment in a way that we've mentioned in previous episodes? So if he was to stay in Charlotte, would we be having the same conversation about Kobe?
I think a lot of people potentially had access to these individuals, but he says, I asked a ton of questions. I was curious. I wanted to improve, learn, and fill my head with the history of the game. No matter who I was with, a coach, a Hall of Famer, a teammate, no matter the situation, game, practice, vacation, I would fire away with question after question. So I think it is, yes, you can be in proximity to those individuals, but do you have the confidence? Do you have the curiosity? Do you have that growth mindset to ask those pointed questions and to continuously ask over and over and over again?
Curiosity is an absolute superpower.
Well said. I think we can jump to the next part. So he said, my mental preparation varied based on my headspace. It varied based on where I thought my head needed to be for that specific game. If I needed to soothe myself, I might play the same soundtrack I listened to on the bus in high school to put me back in that place. It's all about putting me in the place I need to be for that game. Some games required more intensity, so I would need to get my character and my mind in that animated zone. Other games, I needed calm. In that situation, I wouldn't listen to music. Sometimes even, I would sit in total silence. The key, though, is being aware of how you're feeling and how you need to be feeling. It all starts with awareness. He's really diving into emotional regulation and being in the right mindset and the right emotional state before the game. I like that idea of a thermostat, and he's dialing it up and down depending upon how he's feeling. He's in complete control of his inner thermostat and making sure he is ready and prepared, whether he needs to get hyped up or whether he needs to calm himself down.
I really love the fact that he's recognized that music has an impact on where he can get to in terms of his emotions and his sort of energy level going into a game. And one of the things that I think about perhaps too much is what other people are listening to when they're warming up. And you actually see this quite a lot in the NBA. They warm up with the big cans on their ears. And I'm always thinking, what are you listening to? Are you listening to something with a purpose? Because it's going to be having an impact on you. What Kobe's doing here is using it as a tool to either raise or lower where he needs to be to perform at his best. I really love that idea of that thermostat analogy, being able to really dial it in and know what's the comfortable sort of temperature for him going into that performance.
The game is full of ebbs and flows, the good, the bad, and everything in between. With all that going on around me, I had to figure out how to steel my mind and keep it calm and centered. That's not to say emotions didn't spike or drop here or there, but I was always aware enough to recalibrate and to bring them back to a level before things spiral. I could do that in ways others couldn't, And that was really key for me.
I really love that word recalibrate. So you calibrate, right? That's something that you do on the front end. Have an understanding of where you perform at your best. So you might hear it said that everyone has their individual zone in which they perform best, or their, we might call it optimum arousal or optimal energy level. And usually what happens within that individual zone is sort of the stars align, and they're physically where they need to be. Mentally, they're switched on. They're able to pay attention. Their emotions are usually quite level and where they need to be for that person. But that might look very, very different for other people. You might, Duncan, for example, you might like to play really, really sort of hyped up and quite spiked. I might like to play really, really calm and really, really low. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's just having an understanding of what works best for you as a performer. Now, what's really important is that acknowledgement that you are going to move in and out of this zone as things happen. That's one of the reasons why we love sport, because it's so emotional and it goes ups and down, it has ups and downs, and so unpredictable. We don't know what's going to happen. But being able to know that you have a tool in those unpredictable moments and you are able to recalibrate, that's a really great skill to have. But again, it goes back to that idea of learning, practicing it, and transferring it into the big moments when it really matters.
If you really want to be great at something, you have to really care about it. If you want to be great in any particular area, you have to obsess over it. A lot of people say they want to be great, but they're not willing to make the sacrifices necessary to achieve greatness. They have other concerns, whether important or not, and they spread themselves out. That's totally fine. After all, greatness is not for everyone. I love this. It's a bit of a dig, I think. Greatness is not for everyone, but it is for Kobe. He talks about greatness, and you have to obsess over it.
I think obsessing over the stuff that makes you eventually become great is really where the focus needs to be here. Yeah, being great is a nice North Star and it can sit in the background, but that isn't the thing that you obsess over. It's about the characteristics of greatness, the behaviors of greatness, the choices of greatness. And when you put all those things together, greatness comes as a result of it.
What I'm saying is, greatness isn't easy to achieve. It requires a lot of time, a lot of sacrifices. It requires a lot of tough choices. It requires your loved ones to sacrifice too. So you have to have an understanding circle of friends and family. Respect to those who achieve greatness, and respect to those who are chasing that elusive feeling. So everyone wants to be great, Greg, until they figure out what it takes to get there. And that's part of what this podcast is about, charting the path to greatness and what helped those performers be at their best.
As he says, it's not for everyone. And you've talked about hard choices, easy life, or easy choices, hard life. It's very, very easy to make easy choices, and it's very, very hard to make hard choices. And the path to greatness, I think it's a hard one.
Yeah, great point. Elite environments and greatness isn't and can't be for everyone by definition. And part of it is the physical toll that it takes on your body. And Kobe says, I always listen to my body. That's the best advice I can give. Listen to your body and warm up with purpose. If you want to be a great basketball player, you have to be in great shape. I also worked relentlessly to make sure my legs and lungs were always at peak performance. And I contrast this to Tyson, who we heard in the last episode, who really neglected his physical conditioning at key moments in his career. And Kobe, over a 20-year career, never neglected his physical conditioning.
We've used the term monotonous consistency and doing the kind of unglamorous stuff over and over again. No one would say that stretching and taking care of your body and making sure that you're in that kind of physical fitness is a glamorous thing to do, but it is an absolute requirement, prerequisite. We saw, as you said, with Mike Tyson, that caught up to him without a shadow of a doubt. And I think there's examples perhaps from the boxing world. Maybe Floyd Mayweather's a good example where he's constantly in great condition physically, and that speaks to the longevity of his career.
And what we're talking about is preparation. And he says, I never thought about my daily preparation. It wasn't a matter of whether it was an option or not. It was. If I want to play, this is what I have to do. So I just show up and do it. My routine was grueling. It involved early mornings and late nights. It involved stretching, lifting, training, hooping, recovery, and film study. It involved putting in a lot of work and hours. There wasn't a choice for Kobe. Like he took the choice out of, there wasn't a should I, shouldn't I. No, there was no option, he said.
This is where motivation and discipline play a role. When motivation goes, if you don't have discipline, that's when you don't show up, whether that's to lift or whether that's to run or whether that's to do the really unglamorous things. That's where discipline comes in. And routine is something that helps to give you control over that discipline.
With elite players and elite environments, we often have elite coaches. And I think this is good to touch on Kobe's ideas on coaching. And he says, coaches are teachers. Some coaches, lesser coaches, try telling you things. Good coaches, however, teach you how to think and arm you with the fundamental tools necessary to execute properly. Simply put, good coaches make sure you know how to use both hands, how to make proper reads, how to understand the game. Good coaches tell you where the fish are. Great coaches teach you how to find them. That's the same at every level.
I love that. We've talked in a couple of episodes about creating self-reliant athletes and athletes that have the autonomy to be able to figure things out themselves. We talked about the limitations of Tyson in the last episode when he didn't have those self-regulation skills after Customado died. That is ultimately the goal of good coaching, to make yourself redundant and basically just sit back, enjoy the game, and let your athletes take care of business.
And as we've already touched on, probably the greatest of all time, Phil Jackson. He talks about Phil here and he says, Phil Jackson was more than just a coach. He was a visionary. Phil was about scale. He taught concepts within basketball, but more so the macro concept of basketball. He was able to teach without lecturing the importance of being a team and how to get from point A to point B to point championship. He was able to get guys to understand energy, flow, and meditation. So, Greg, I'm going to throw an analogy at you, see if you like this one, because I know you're an analogy guy. So I think teaching is about, having a seed, having a piece of information and a piece of knowledge. And if you think about a seed, it could be packed with all the potential, the amazing beauty and energy. So a seed is really just potential. Now, however good you are as a teacher, when you implant that seed, it's all about the garden. It's about the ground in which you're laying that seed. So if you're going to throw an amazing seed into horrible, rocky, dry wasteland, it's not going to thrive. But if you throw that seed that has that energy and potential and it's got all that information and you throw it into some amazing soil, that seed is going to sprout. So when you get Phil Jackson as this amazing knowledge and you have Kobe Bryant, who is so open-minded, he is this soil. He will take in everything. So combine the greatest coach of all time with one of the greatest players who is willing to listen and willing to succeed. I'm going to throw that analogy in there.
And you're listening to Gardener's Question Time with Dr. Duncan Simpson. No, I love that analogy. And I think to flip it around, that often what we see from, let's call them bad coaches, is if that seed doesn't grow, they blame the seed, as opposed to trying to change the conditions or trying to change the environment in which that seed is best going to thrive in. So I really like that idea, and wonderful job on the analogy. I think you're right. That seed is full of potential, but if it's not put in the environment in which it can thrive, then it is just wasted potential.
I'm glad it landed. There you go. So I think he's learned a lot of the fundamentals and he's going to dive into some of the nuances of the game. And the first one he talks about, and it's a pretty well-known story about the referee's handbook, but he said, I made a point of reading the referee's handbook. One of the rules I gleaned from it was that each referee had a designated slot where he is supposed to be on the floor. If the ball, for instance, is in place W, referees X, Y, and Z each have an area on the court assigned to them. When they do that, it creates dead zones, areas on the floor where they can't see certain things. I learned where those zones were. I took advantage of them. I would get away with holds and travels and all sorts of minor violations simply because I took the time to understand the officials' limitations. I don't know there's many athletes that would dive into the referee's handbook with the intention of trying to find a performance edge. And that's what he's doing here.
It feels like a spy film where they're trying to find out where the cameras are, and like a prison escape movie, maybe, where they're trying to see where the security cameras are and where the blind spots are, and when does he cycle off and go on his break, to get that competitive advantage. But as we talk about with elite performance sport, the margins are so small, and trying to find advantages and taking advantages where you can get them, I think that's just intelligent play.
And another area that he really tried to, maximize was his footwear. And he says, I took the designs of my Nikes very seriously. Again, it goes back to craft and detail. For some players, sneakers were all about looks and shine. For me, it was always about peak performance. It was about the fact I was on my feet for 48 minutes a night and relied on them to do a job. I was an absolute perfectionist about the technology that went into my signature sneakers. I cared about every little detail. I cared about the weight distribution, the materials, the cut, the traction, the durability. I was meticulous about every curve, contour, and stitch. I didn't want any loose ends. I didn't want my foot sliding in my shoe. I didn't want anything that could take my focus, even for an instant, off my game. My sneakers didn't just have to be comfortable, they had to help me perform better. Nike, fortunately, loved that kind of challenge. Each signature shoe improved on the one before. We were always getting better, always striving for innovation and greatness, always looking ahead. He's really getting into details here, and details matter when you do the big things right first.
It's hugely important to take care of the big rocks first. So we've talked about some of these over the last few episodes. If you're not taking care of sleep, rest, recovery, fueling, hydrating, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what shoes you're wearing. It's kind of like throwing a bucket of water on a 5-alarm fire. If it's not really going to make that much of a difference. But we know from Kobe that he is taking care of all of those things, putting sleep aside perhaps. So when you're looking to gain a competitive advantage, I keep using that word competitive advantage, but that's the separating factor here. Having a focus on what's on your feet, that's a way to do that.
So cycling a little bit back, and we've heard from a lot of our performers about image and that persona they put out into the world. And Kobe said, when I was young, my mindset was image, image, image. I took that approach with the media. As I became more experienced, I realized no matter what, people are going to like you or not like you. So be authentic and let them like you or not like you for who you actually are. At that point, I started keeping all of my answers blunt and straightforward. I would mix in some humor and some sarcasm too. I think fans and reporters came to appreciate that, came to appreciate the real me. So I think as we've seen with a few of our performers, Greg, as they go through their career, they start to understand, they start to craft their image a little bit. And for me, image is a bit like a mask. What mask are you going to put on at any given time? And he's chosen a little bit later on in his career, I'm just going to be authentic. I'm going to be me, whether you like it or not.
If that is what helps him perform at his best and be most focused when it matters, when it counts, I applaud him for making that evolutionary change.
And naturally, Kobe was a staple on the US national team for many years. And he said, when I was on the national team, I could focus on what I wanted to do. With the talent we had, I knew I didn't have to worry about offense. I knew I didn't have to stress over scoring. I was able to single-mindedly focus, like I'd always yearned to, on playing defense. It let me focus on putting opponents in straitjackets and erasing them from the game. Playing with other great players in that sense was fun. For me, Greg, this is really similar to Dan Carter. When he joined the All Blacks for one of the first times in his career, he started to think, I don't have to worry about other people. I can just play my game. Kobe saying, I don't have to now worry about scoring. I can actually focus on defense. This is what I want to do. Wow, this is fun. He doesn't have to carry the team on his back like he did with the Lakers for some of the years.
For sure. I think for me, this is that he doesn't have to do it all. He gets to focus on the parts of his game that he enjoys doing, knowing that other people are going to have his back. And I think you're absolutely right. As soon as I heard this, Dan Carter popped into my head when he made that step up to the All Black side.
And he continues, I was one of the elder statesmen on our national teams. I was the alpha in the locker room. I really didn't pick anyone else's brain. If anything, because I was so much more experienced, other guys would approach me about incorporating aspects of my game into theirs. For the most part, we discussed executional elements of basketball, because the international game is played differently. I had an edge because I grew up playing in Italy, so I would help guys adjust how they were processing the actions and our scheme. So here we're seeing him be a leader in the locker room. He doesn't need to pick other people's brains, but he will impart his knowledge. And part of it is that growing up in Italy and knowing the international game a little more than other people.
So this really takes us back to the very beginning of this episode when I said that you need to pause, share this episode with 2 other people. This is what great leaders do. So don't fool yourself. Be a great leader. This is what they're doing, imparting wisdom, right? Yes, you can wait for people to ask you to send podcast recommendations, or you can be on the front foot and you can send that podcast recommendation, your favorite episode of Performers, out to them and be on the front foot. So go ahead and do that.
Great plug. Great plug.
Shameless plug. Shameless plug.
So we've talked a little bit about listening to music, and I love this section here. He says, most players listen to music every game. They have the headphones on religiously and use the music to get them in the right state of mind. They'd even sing and dance. I rarely ever did that. Sometimes, even when I had headphones on, there wasn't any music playing. It was a feint to keep people away and to get in my zone. For the most part before games, I just liked being there, hearing the sounds of the environment and observing everything. I made every second of the national anthem count. During those precious moments, I'm hearing all the little sounds and imbibing the energy of the arena. I'm taking the opportunity to be aware of what's going on, to be aware of my teammates around me, the basket in front of me, the basket behind me, all the other sounds and objects. It's full concentration and understanding of the arena. It's really about just absorbing and being where your feet are.
I've talked about this with athletes as being, what do you do and how do you embrace the quiet moments of performance? Now, obviously, it's not a technically quiet moment with a national anthem blasting out over a PA system, but this is a quiet moment in terms of performance where you don't have any performance demands. And how are you able to use these quiet moments to your advantage?
So Kobe is notorious about what a difficult teammate that he was. And he said, I like challenging people and making them uncomfortable. That's what leads to introspection, and that's what leads to improvement. You could say I dared people to be their best selves. That approach never wavered. What I did adjust, though, was how I varied my approach from player to player. I still challenged everyone and made them uncomfortable. I just did it in a way that was tailored to them. To learn what would work and for who, I started doing homework and watched how they behaved. I learned their histories and listened to what their goals were. I learned what made them feel secure and where their greatest doubts lay. Once I understood them, I could help bring the best out of them by touching the right nerve at the right moment. Once guys understood my motivation, they started to fall in line. As I got older, they didn't even need to understand why. They instinctively followed. They knew what my goals for the team were, and they knew what I was trying to do. For me, Greg, just so similar. Some of the wording is almost identical to Pat Summitt, how she adjusted her coaching style over the years to connect with players at different levels. And that's what he's doing. He's saying, I'm not going to be uncompromising in terms of how I'm going to push people and make them feel very uncomfortable and push them to their very edge because I want them to be the best, but I am going to adjust how I'm going to go about it.
Very individualized approach. I think with Pat Summitt, we talked about how she discovered eventually how to treat people the way that they needed to be treated in the moment, in the context, that would get the best out of them. One of the things as you were reading through that jumped out to me is the notion of comfort the troubled and trouble the comfortable. So knowing when to provoke or prod someone who's maybe a little bit comfortable to get the best out of them, or when someone's struggling, maybe going through a little bit of a tough time, being able to comfort them and sort of help them along as a teammate. I think Pat Summitt struck a really nice balance with that as she got a little bit later in her career. Maybe she didn't start there by her own admission, but I think that's what Kobe's doing here too.
So despite playing at the highest level for 20 years, Kobe said, I never felt outside pressure. I knew what I wanted to accomplish, and I knew how much work it took to achieve those goals. I then put in the work and trusted in it. Besides, the expectations I placed on myself were higher than what anyone expected from me. People make a huge deal out of clutch shots. Thing is, it's just one shot. If you make thousands of shots a day, it's just one of 1,000. Once you're hitting that many, what's one more? That was my mentality from day one.
I think everyone else that we've looked at has talked about pressure, but he hasn't. Although he has, because he talks about the fact that he hasn't felt pressure, so he still brings the concept of the topic up. And I think this goes back to this perception of pressure. So he might never have felt it, but there are all of those different elements that might produce pressure for everyone else. So for Agassi, Lindsey Vonn, Mike Tyson, Dan Carter, we know that pressure was a part of their experience. For Kobe, it doesn't sound that way. Maybe he's got coping mechanisms for that, having a really clear understanding of what he wants to do and the standards that he puts himself under. But it's about that perception. He doesn't feel like there's pressure. That's his reality. That's where he performs from. For some people, the exact same set of circumstances might be incredibly pressure filled. But for him and his capabilities and the tools that he's got, he just doesn't feel it. And that's pretty evident in the way that he plays.
And I think if we jump to a specific year in 2003, that was really a special year for Kobe. And he says in 2003, it was a wrap for everybody. There was nothing emotionally, mentally, physically, strategically, anyone could do that season to stop me. For some people, I guess, it might be hard to stay sharp once you've reached the pinnacle. Not for me, though. It was never enough. I always wanted to be better, wanted more. I can't really explain it. Other than that, I love the game, and I have a very short memory. That fueled me until the day I hung up my sneakers. So, Greg, in that year, he's at his absolute pinnacle, but he says when he reaches the top, he's not going to stop. He's going to keep going.
I think we've mentioned that it can be difficult once you've reached the summit, as it were, to really kind of get a glimpse on an understanding of what's next. You know, where do we go from here? This feels great in the moment, but ultimately, what's my next destination? And for him, it just seems like repeat, 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 where he wants to be the best, but consistently be the best. Not be a one-hit wonder, as it were, but just develop that catalog of just timeless classics that are played over and over and over again. So there's an analogy for you. It really feels like that's what his guiding light is here.
Yeah, and over the course, Greg, of 20 years, inevitably, injuries are going to catch up on you. It's a grueling game, and he played at such an intensity, and he was relentless in everything he did. So, injuries are part of a high performance environment. And he says, over the course of 20 seasons, I suffered my fair share of serious injuries. The first thing I always thought about in those situations was, what do I need to get back to 100%? That was my mindset. I never let fear or doubt seep into my psyche. I never whined and I never complained. I mean, what for? It's interesting because we've heard a few of the other athletes, Dan Carter in particular, really struggled with injury and it really affected him psychologically.
Yeah, I think the pragmatic approach makes it very digestible and very short term, where it's what are the behaviors that I need to take part in today. You know, usually those are things that are laid out by an athletic trainer or a doctor or sort of physiotherapy staff, as opposed to the big picture of things of I'm injured and the emotional response that comes along with being injured and what's the implication of this long term for my career and self-identity as an athlete and all of these different things. But if you can be somewhat, it's actually somewhat cold and somewhat clinical way to approach things here of what is it that I literally need to do right now in order to help this injury heal and get myself back to where I need to be. That seems to be his mindset and his approach here, and it seems to have worked for him.
And he highlights that approach here and he says, on the fractures, small breaks, and sprains, I asked myself a different question. Will it get worse if I play through it? If it was going to be painful but not get worse, I'd deal with it 100% of the time. That was the only thought process for me. So he just has this bigger purpose. And I've used this statement before, kind of when purpose is bigger than pain, purpose wins. He was just such a competitor. A small break, he talks about breaking fingers, fractures, spraining ankles. He's going to play. As long as it's not going to make the injury worse, he will play through the pain.
And I think that maybe we glamorize playing through pain a little bit when it comes to injury. You know, and I think we see that in society a little bit where, particularly power and performance sports, which basketball is a power and performance sport, things like football, rugby, American football as well, that sometimes we need to actually do what he said he was very, very good at and listen to his body. So a little bit of a cautionary tale, you know, make sure that you're looking after yourself and doing what you need to do to continue to live that high performance lifestyle. But also if you have the capabilities to go through and maybe it isn't going to get worse, that could be a bit of a mental challenge for you to push through and test your resilience.
So on April 13th, 2016 versus the Utah Jazz, in his final game, Kobe Bryant scores 60 points. And he says, I lost track of time. I started the final day of my NBA career at the office. I was working on some stories and exciting future projects, and I just got wrapped up in the work. Next thing I knew, I looked up and realized it was already time to go. The trip to the Staples Center was just another trip for me. It might have been my 1,346th and final regular season game for me, but it felt like any other. The mood in the arena Didn't feel that way though. When I arrived, there was a palpable, somber energy. It felt sort of sad, but I didn't want that. I wanted the night to be a celebration. I wanted the night to be full of life. And I realized it was on me to change those vibes. After I suited up and hit the court, I could tell I didn't have my legs. In that moment, I realized it was going to be one of my greatest performances of all time or one of the worst. I kind of laughed at the very thought of it for a second, smiled because I always stay prepared to play on heavy legs. Then I just went out and hooped. The game started, and I was acutely focused. I was in the moment, and any small thoughts of it being my final game disappeared. The game became the game I played professionally nearly for 20 years, the tactical game that I excelled in, the game of chess that I always played and loved. And that is where we'll leave it. Greg, success leaves clues, and he's one of the greatest basketball players of all time. I feel like this book is already a roadmap to success in itself, so I highly recommend anybody reading it. But what are your top 10 takeaways from Kobe Bryant's story?
Number 1, unwavering dedication and preparation. Success demands relentless preparation and dedication, and Kobe's commitment to meeting and preparing at any hour showed his dedication to winning and leading by example. He said, if you want to be a better player, you have to prepare, and prepare some more. Number 2, embrace the learning process. Mastery requires continuous learning and adaptation. Kobe's ability to quickly learn and incorporate new skills into his game set him apart from his peers. I could see something, download it, and have it down pat. Number 3, cultivate internal motivation. True greatness comes from an internal drive, not external validation. Kobe's desire to excel and dominate was fueled by an internal craving to be the best, not by comparisons to others. From day one, I wanted to dominate. Number 4, maintain a growth mindset. Embrace challenges as opportunities for growth. Kobe viewed missed shots and failures as necessary steps towards acquiring new skills. He says, I wasn't scared of missing, looking bad, or being embarrassed. Number 5, the value of mentorship and learning from the greats. Engaging with his mentors and legends of the game can accelerate personal and professional growth just like it did for Kobe. His practice of asking questions and learning from basketball legends and his attention to detail in his interactions with them made sure that those were really, really useful for him. Those guys taught me the lessons that give me an edge over my competition. Number 6, balance intensity with family commitment. Achieving greatness doesn't require sacrificing personal relationships. Kobe's legendary midnight workouts allowed him to excel professionally while being present for his family. He says, I wasn't willing to sacrifice my game, but I also wasn't willing to sacrifice my family time. Number 7, strategic and analytical thinking. Success requires more than hard work. It demands smart work and strategic thinking. Kobe's study of the referee's handbook to understand and exploit the game's rules gave him a competitive edge. I learned where those zones were, and I took advantage of them. Number 8, authenticity and self-expression. Being true to oneself is more important than external perceptions. Kobe's evolution in dealing with the media and crafting his public image based on authenticity helped to set him apart. So be authentic and let them like you or not for who you actually are. Number 9, leadership through challenge and support. Effective leadership involves challenging others while understanding and supporting their individual needs. Kobe's approach to leadership by making teammates uncomfortable to promote growth, tailored to each individual, helped those people around him grow. I dared people to be their best selves. And finally, number 10, the Mamba Mentality as a way of life. The pursuit of excellence is a continuous process that applies to all areas of life. Kobe's philosophy of focusing on the process and journey towards achieving results, not just the outcomes, is the moral of this story. The mindset isn't about seeking a result, it's more about the process of getting to that result. As Duncan mentioned at the top of the episode, this is a slightly different book to what we've been used to. This isn't an autobiography per se, so it is pretty much stocked full of all of the good stuff. So today, we're going to avoid the 10 things to avoid, and we're going to leave it there for today. Hopefully there's a ton of lessons that you can take away from Kobe Bryant's life and learnings, and thank you ever so much for joining myself and Duncan on Performers.